Hey everyone, my name is Jesse, and today we're going to be talking about apocalypses. So, not your usual zombies and the end of the world and destruction, but more so how people always have the feeling of despair and they always feel like they're living in the final chapters of history. This idea comes from a guy named Frank Kermode who wrote The Sense of an Ending. He is a literary critic, and I'm going to break down how his ideas explain why we're so obsessed with apocalyptic stories. Throughout the presentation, I'll be comparing his work and his theories to modern media and as well as previous books that we've read. I'll also be comparing and contrasting him to other authors that we've read and comparing and contrasting their ideals. So before we get into how this all connects to modern media, let's break down what Frank Kermode is actually saying in The Sense of an Ending. This book, I believe, is all about how we structure time in stories and why we always feel like we're at the end of something. So one of the quotes from the book is, "We project ourselves imaginatively into a future ceasing. We transform the future into a simple end." So I believe what he's saying is we mentally fast forward to the end so that history feels like it's a clear stopping point. But in reality, the future isn't a single event. It keeps going on even after what we think of as the end. This is very evident, I feel like, in apocalypse stories. The apocalypse stories compress time to give us a sense of closure, even if life actually never works that way. As for the second quote, "The paradigms of apocalypse continue to lie under our actions, our hopes, and our words. They persist because they offer comfort, the sense of an ending, the possibility of order." So correlating this to apocalypse stories, I believe what it's saying is that apocalypse stories make chaos feel organized. So the reason that they're organized is to help us like kind of process how big scary changes go about. And ultimately, I feel like as human beings, we don't like uncertainty. So we create narratives where history has a clear start and finish. So that's why I feel like this quote conveys is that we need something. When it comes to apocalypse stories, we need something to have a start and finish so we have a better understanding of it. To make sense of their span, they need fictive concords with origins and ends. So similar to the previous quote, I feel like this quote also has a similar meaning where humans can't handle randomness, that we need stories to have a clear structure so that life feels safe almost, and that we in a sense kind of create false beginnings and endings to feel like events make sense. So I feel like this quote is very similar to the previous one, but it really emphasizes like we create false beginnings and we need endings to make our life events make sense. I did want to mention that there's a clear difference between Kermode and Eco. So Kermode says that we crave endings because they help us make sense of time. We want stories to have a clear conclusion. Unlike Eco, on the other hand, he argues in Opera Apparata that stories aren't meant to be closed off. Their meaning is always, it's kind of open-ending, so it's open for us to interpret them. I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but I feel like Italy is the perfect example of a place that's been through multiple apocalypses. So we have like the Roman Empire, the Black Death wiped out tons of cities. Mussolini's rise and fall was a complete reset. But the wild thing is that Italy, throughout everything going through what they would consider the end of time, Italy kept going. It still exists now. And I feel like this really emphasizes that history is a series of collapse and rebirth. So this is super relevant to like stories today. Even in Italian cinema, like La Dolce Vita and Gomorrah, there's this vibe that society is always kind of rotting from the inside. Okay, so let's bring this into modern media. So White Lotus Season 2 is basically about social collapse. The whole show is about decay, not of the world, of course, but of morality. We start with a dead body from the jump, and we know things are going to fall apart. It's got the same we're at the end of something energy that Kermode talks about. Then there's Gladiator, which is literally about the end of an empire. Rome is crumbling, and Maximus is caught in his political collapse. But here's where Kermode comes in. His death isn't really the end because history keeps going. The empire lasts, but everything feels like it's ending. This is exactly how Kermode says we tell stories, where an ending is just a setup for something new. Okay, so let's take a couple steps back and kind of figure out why does this matter beyond movies and TV shows, right? So I feel like Kermode's whole point is that apocalypse stories help us process real fears and hesitations. So every time history gets messy, whether it's Rome falling, fascism rising, or even with climate change, we create stories that make it feel inevitable. Like, yep, this is the end. But if history tells us anything, it's that there's always something after. Not necessarily something to look forward to, but there's always something that's going to happen afterwards. This is why I feel like Italy is such a good, like, kind of like a case study because it's had so many endings, but it keeps reinventing itself. That's kind of what these stories help us do. Prepare for whatever's to come next and whatever is to reinvent itself next. Okay, so where do we go from here? Kermode says we're always living in the midst, which basically means never really reaching the end. We're just constantly rewriting it. So kind of like the rebirth and reinventation that I've been talking about previously. Men, like poets, rush into the midst in media res when they are born. They also die in the midst. So every time a new crisis comes up, whether it's AI, climate disaster, or a new world order, we frame it as the final chapter. But if history is anything to go by, I think it's probably more so another cycle than the final chapter. So, for example, in Gladiator, Maximus dies, but Rome keeps going. Or in White Lotus, one of the main characters, Tanya, dies, but the resort is still running. The apocalypse never actually arrives because we just keep adjusting to whatever is coming next. Okay, so now we're going to explore the themes of apocalypse in some of the previous books that we've read. So usually when we think about apocalypse, we imagine something big, right? Like explosions, chaos, zombies, etc., the world falling apart. But in Argo and His Master, it takes a totally different approach, I feel. It's not about a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, personal kind of apocalypse. Argo and His Master is a very interesting story because the story is told from the perspective of a dog. And for the dog, the world isn't ending in some huge dramatic way, but instead it's kind of like falling apart in small, like quiet moments because his master is getting older, their routines are changing, and things just don't make sense like they used to, at least from a dog's perspective. And I think that's where Kermode comes in. He says that apocalypse isn't just about destruction, it's about how we process change and endings. And in Argo's case, he's not seeing the fire and the ruin. He's experiencing confusion, loss, and slow breakdown of the only world he knows, which is his owner, his master. It's an apocalypse, but like just on a smaller and more intimate scale. I feel like this is a great opportunity to bring in both Kermode and Berto's theories and how they're incorporated into Argo and His Master. So as we know, Kermode says we tell stories with a clear ending because we need structure. We want to believe that things have a definite beginning and end because we're human beings. We want to make sense of that. But life isn't that simple, especially in Argo's case, because Argo doesn't understand what's happening and the book doesn't express Argo's feelings really about what's really happening. And that's where I feel like Echo's idea of the opera apparata comes in. He argues that stories don't have one fixed meaning. Interpretation depends on the reader, really. So I think instead of this being considered like a typical apocalypse where everything ends in like catastrophe or despair, this story just leaves you kind of like a lingering feeling, and that's a bit unsettling at times. Okay, so let's kind of rethink what an apocalypse actually is. Kermode talks about how we always feel like we're at the end of something, whether it's the world, a relationship, or a phase of life, or college. But the truth is, we're in the middle of things and life keeps moving even when it feels like it's falling apart. I definitely feel that. I feel like that's exactly what's happening in Argo and His Master. The world isn't really ending, but for Argo, it feels like it is. His master is changing his routine and is causing him to break down, and everything is just happening all at once that once made sense, but now it doesn't. And I feel like that's the big idea. Apocalypse isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about losing the world as you knew it, or the person that or thing that was your world being gone, and now you feel like you have no purpose. We've been talking about apocalypse as an event, but what if it isn't? What if it's just a slow shift that we don't even notice until it's already happened? Like, think about climate change. It's not the world ends in one big moment. It's gradual, rising temperatures, more disasters. ecosystems collapsing little by little. By the time we realize it's already been happening for decades. Same thing with aging and loss. For someone that's growing old or losing their independence, the world isn't what it used to be, even though life around them keeps going. That's exactly what happens in Argo and his master, which is like a slow unraveling and not like a sudden catastrophe. And then society itself, things don't collapse overnight, and societies are like, changing little by little. And before we even process it, we look around and for some people there's nothing left or it's drastically different. And that's the kind of apocalypse that Spivo is showing us, one that happens gradually and we barely notice it. And bringing it back to Echo, who what we consider as an apocalypse, it really depends on our own perspective. If we experience change differently, the idea of an end, does it even really exist, or is it just something we create to make sense of the world? So let's talk about Italio Calvino's dialogue with the tortoise. This story really flips the whole idea of time and endings around. In the story, a man named Palomar is talking to a tortoise, and the tortoise basically tells him, you think time works a certain way because you're human, but that's just the way you're seeing things. And I feel like that really embodies kind of like, as human beings, how we think about apocalypses. Kermode says we crave clear endings because they help us make sense of time. But what if endings are just a human illusion? This ties back to Argo and his master, because Argo doesn't understand the world ending the way a human would. It's like the tortoise doesn't understand the experience of time and just life in general like Palomar does. That's where Echo comes in again. If meaning isn't fixed and depends on who's experiencing it, then maybe apocalypse isn't even real. It's just like a shift in our perspective. We all obviously experience time and change differently. So the question is there really an end, or is apocalypse just another way of saying things aren't the way that things aren't this way that they used to be? I feel like that's kind of the wild idea. We always think of the apocalypse as a final dramatic event, but it's just about shifting your perspective on the way you view things. So let's go back to Kermode for a second. He says we tell stories in a way that makes history feel structured, beginning, middle, and end. But in reality, history doesn't stop, it just keeps going. We only label something as an apocalypse when it feels like our vision of the world is disappearing. And that's exactly what happens in Argo and his master. To him, his master's aging and, the change in behavior. I feel like the end of everything, but it's not. It's just a change. The world around him still exists. It's just no longer the way he used to understand it. So let's apply this to real life real quick. How many times in history have people thought this is the end? The fall of the Roman Empire, people thought civilization was collapsing, but society didn't end. It just simply changed or evolved, some people would say. Like, this is where Echo's open word comes in. The meaning of an event isn't fixed. It changes depending on who's experiencing it. One person's apocalypse might be just another person's, like, their day to day. It's a regular Tuesday for them. And this is exactly what Calvino's tortoise is saying. Mr. Palomar sees time one way, the tortoise sees it in another, and neither is necessarily wrong or right. So ultimately, I feel like maybe apocalypse isn't about destruction, it's about perception. Maybe it's just a word we use when we don't know how to process the way the world is changing. And if that's true, then this is where we kind of wonder, is this really the end, or are we just always in the middle of something new? Okay, the final slide, so let's wrap things up. So I have the Kermode quote: the paradigms of apocalypse continue to lie under our actions, our hopes, and our words. They persist because they offer comfort, the sense of an ending, the possibility of order. Basically, we tell apocalypse stories to give structure to chaos, as I said in the very beginning of my presentation. Even though history never actually stops, we need to believe in endings to make sense of the world. But let's take it kind of a step further. If apocalypse isn't a single event, but a process, then maybe it's not about destruction at all. Maybe it's just about how we process change. And I feel like Italy is such great proof of this because it has gone through so many apocalypses, like the fall of the Rome, the Black Death, fascism, etc. But did Italy actually end? No, it didn't. It just reshaped itself. or more so I should say adapted itself. That's exactly what we see in modern media, whether it's in Argo and His Master, White Lotus, which was taking place in Italy, and the director said like there's a reason why he chose Italy was because of the destruction and rebirth of it all. So there's some metaphors there. We also see in Gladiator, that was a historical event that happened in Italy. We're not watching the end. We're more so watching a transition in these movies and shows. So to wrap everything up, I think we need to stop thinking that we're doomed when it comes to apocalypse. Maybe we just need to rethink what an ending is. So, for example, it's not the finish line, it's just another transition. And in the sense, we're never really at the end, we're just in the middle of whatever comes next.